Hello all. This video is an overview of the ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument is one of the classical arguments that is still used today in some form. The earliest known example is generally held to be from Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, in his text the Proslogian. The most popular version of the ontological argument today is Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument. The ontological argument is actually a family of arguments that are characterized as attempts to prove God's existence from the definition of God. That is, they have God's definition as their premise and his existence as their conclusion. To see how this works, let's start by looking at Anselm's original argument. Now, due to the imprecise nature of natural language, there is dispute over what Anselm's argument actually was, with philosophers advancing slightly different arguments. The version I'll use apparently comes from Scott Moore, a philosopher at Baylor University. Before I present the actual argument, I need to mention Anselm's terminology. His ontological argument is not a standalone argument for the existence of a Christian God. Similarly to the cosmological argument, it attempts to prove the existence of some God, and he then devoted the rest of the Proslogian to establishing that this God had the characteristics of the Christian God. So, his ontological argument refers to a more generic God, which he refers to as a being than which none greater can be conceived. That is, the greatest conceivable being. So, here's the argument. 1. One can conceive of a being than which none greater can be conceived. Existence in reality is greater than existence only in the mind. If the being we conceive of exists only in the mind, then it is not a being than which none greater can be conceived. A being than which none greater can be conceived must exist in reality. We then label the being than which none greater can be conceived as God. Anselm had a fairly wordy way of expressing it, but the basic idea is that existence is better than non-existence, God is the best, therefore God must exist. There are a few points to note here. One reason that I like the ontological argument is that it is one of the few attempts to prove God's existence as a logical necessity. Most arguments for God's existence are inductive or probabilistic proofs, such as the cosmological argument or the teleological argument. These arguments, if successful, would only allow us to conclude that God's existence is likely or the best explanation. The ontological argument, on the other hand, would allow us to conclude that God must necessarily exist. That is nice, because if we take seriously the maxim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, then the ontological argument can actually satisfy that demand. The other thing to note is that, aside from quibbles about premise 1, the argument is a purely analytic one. That is, it makes no reference to the world as it actually is, and argues only from logical necessity. This means that, if successful, the argument would hold true in every possible world and needs no empirical support. To further explore this, I want to explain what's meant by an analytic proposition. For my purposes here, an analytic proposition is one that makes no reference to the way that the world actually is. For example, 1 plus 2 equals 3 is true by virtue of the mathematical definitions involved. There is no need to perform an experiment or refer to facts of reality in order to establish that it's true. In contrast, a synthetic proposition is one which can only be shown to be true or false by reference to some fact of reality. For example, that the Earth revolves around the Sun is a synthetic proposition. There is no way of establishing whether it is true or false without some knowledge of the way that the world actually is, or some fact of reality. Another way of looking at the analytic-synthetic distinction is through the a priori, a posteriori divide. Suppose that you're involved in a car accident that so severely injured you that your brain was completely cut off from your sensory nerves, and you experience profound amnesia. You are kept alive in a hospital bed, but your consciousness has no access to the outside world. Furthermore, you have absolutely no recollection of how the world actually is. In this case, all you're aware of is your own disembodied consciousness, your thoughts in your mind. The question here is, what knowledge could you come to in this state? Clearly, you could still reason your way to 1 plus 1 equals 2, and in fact, any mathematical truth is theoretically accessible to you. However, you would have no way of knowing whether the Earth revolved around the Sun, and even whether planets, suns, or gravitation even exists. No matter how long you contemplate it for, nor how intelligent you are, you would never be able to discover through pure thought almost any fact about how reality actually is. Knowledge that depends on the existence of the world is called a posteriori knowledge. That which doesn't depend on any experience of the world is called a priori knowledge. To return to the ontological argument, we can see that Anselm's argument is an attempt to establish God's existence as an a priori truth. This is pretty much a defining feature of all ontological arguments. The idea is, even in the hypothetical example above, where you're stuck in your own mind, you would still be able to reason that a God exists. Now, let's look at Plantinga's modal ontological argument, which is currently the most popular ontological argument. This argument is expressed in modal logic, which is a form of logic that deals with the idea of logical possibility and logical necessity. One way of understanding these ideas is in terms of possible worlds. Most people would accept that there are many aspects of reality that need not be the way that they are. For example, there's probably no logical contradiction inherent in the idea that Al Gore could have become president in 2000. We can consider the world in which Al Gore became president as a possible world, and there would be an infinitude of such possible worlds. Now consider the proposition that 2 plus 2 equals 4. This would still be true in the world in which Al Gore became president, and most people would accept that it would, in fact, be true in every possible world. So we can see that some things must be true, regardless of which world we are in, whereas some things need not be true but can be, like George W. Bush becoming president. Modal logic simply expresses these as necessary truths and possible truths. So it is necessarily true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but only possibly true that George W. Bush became president. There are obvious parallels with the analytic-synthetic and the a priori, a posteriori distinctions. The thrust of the modal ontological argument is to establish that God's existence is a necessary truth, not a possible one. That is, that he must exist in every possible world, and hence exists in ours. The argument is usually expressed as follows. Definition 1. A being has maximal excellence if it is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good in some possible world. Definition 2. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. Premise 1. A maximally great being is possible. Conclusion 1. Therefore, possibly, it is necessary that a maximally great being exists. Conclusion 2. Therefore, it is necessary that a maximally great being exists. And conclusion 3. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. The interesting thing about this argument, and the attraction of it, is that there is only one premise. This argument presents a dilemma to the naive, weak atheist, who must either accept that God exists, or assert that God is logically impossible. Neither statement is particularly palatable. Note that the first two statements are just definitions, and the last three are valid deductions in modal logic. Thus, some people see fit to reject modal logic, since it seems to lead to an unjustified conclusion. But I think this misunderstands modal logic. The actual problem lies in statement 2, the definition of maximal greatness, and the way that it combines with our premise. At first glance, it may seem uncontroversial, but the phrase every possible world is equivalent to saying that it cannot not exist and exists in the actual world. So when the premise says that such a being is possible, it is literally saying there's a possible world in which God exists in every world. That is, in some world, God exists in every world, which is a strange construction. But without a decent understanding of modal logic, that's probably not what most people mean when they agree that a God is possible. Essentially, the argument simply says that a logically necessary being can exist, and hence must exist. But of course, an atheist is hardly compelled to accept the coherence of a logically necessary being. This is the crux of most ontological arguments. Embedded in the definitions is the idea of a being who cannot fail to exist. That is, one whose non-existence is a logical contradiction. Clearly, such a being must exist, or in the modal form, must exist in our world. But none of the ontological arguments actually establish that such a being can exist or is even a coherent idea. At best, they can argue that there's no obvious contradiction in the formulation, but that's just an argument from ignorance or shifting the burden of proof. So, to conclude, an ontological argument generally boils down to the form. Premise: God, by definition, must exist. Conclusion: therefore, God exists. All of the various forms so far posited are increasingly sophisticated ways of making the premise seem reasonable. Now, in my next video, I will present a reformulation of one of Kant's objections to the ontological argument that I think provides a more obvious hurdle that ontological arguments must overcome. Thanks for watching. See you next time.